Right, okay. Next lesson in religious language is the via negativa. So remember the word via or via, depending on how you say it, means by way of, and negativa is Latin for negative. Okay, so the via negativa is by way of negatives. So effectively, via negativa is saying that we can only talk about God in a negative way, which will make sense a bit later on. This, coincidentally, is my favourite part of religious language, and I think it's really easy to understand. So hopefully you will get this too. Now, obviously, if we were in school, we would be doing this all together, but because we are not, I have written, I don't know if you can hear my paper rattling around, I have written the name of a famous person on my piece of paper, and I'm going to explain who this famous person is by telling you what they are not. Okay, see if you can guess my famous person just by telling you what they are not. I'll be interested to hear your guesses. So once you've emailed me to let me know that you've done today's work, email me what your initial guess was to see if anybody was correct. By doing this as a little starter, it will really get you understanding what the via negativa actually is. So, my famous person is not an actor, is not a singer, is not a woman, is not a movie star, is not funny. Think about that one, it's a double negative, so is not funny, is not a Z-list celebrity, they are not usually seen on anything but Channel 4. So have a little guess about who my celebrity might be, and then, like I said, email me your thoughts. This is a really, really good way of trying to get your head around what via negativa actually is, but also some of the strengths of via negativa, but some of the weaknesses as well. So it might not make a huge amount of sense right now as to why we're doing this, but it is important, and it will get your brain thinking, definitely. Okay, so what does via negativa actually mean? Like I've said, the word via or via, depending on how you say it, means by way of. Now, via is not the first time we've seen this. We've seen it when we have a look at Grace Davis and Vicarious Religion, because she's basically saying that we live through, or kind of we try and live through Christianity, even though we might not necessarily accept it into our own lives. And like I said, negativa also means negative, or means negative in Latin. So via negativa is an approach to religious language which tries to make all forms of God talk meaningful rather than meaningless. Okay, so it's the negative way in which one person should approach the subject of God. Now, basically, via negativa says that we can't talk about God in positive terms. So we can't say things like God is good, God is loving, God is fair, etc., etc., because it's misleading and anthropomorphizes God. So what do I mean when I say actually anthropomorphizes God? Well, first of all, hopefully you remember that anthropomorphism is basically making God more on a human level. So the via negativa says that if we're talking about God in positive terms, i.e. God is good, then I am limiting him. I'm limiting him to my understanding of what God or what good actually is. Not only that, I can use the word good for anything else. So I think I've used this analogy before, but Max, my dog, is good. He's a good dog. And it doesn't make sense for me to use the same word good talking about Max the dog and also trying to talk about God at the same time. I'm literally lowering how good God is because I'm saying that God is as good as Max the dog. Again, hopefully that makes sense. So by talking about God in a positive way, by telling you what he actually is, I'm limiting him to my own human understanding. So the Via Negativa says that instead of talking about God in a positive way, we should talk about God in a negative way. Now, this doesn't mean things like God is bad and God is evil. It doesn't mean things like that, because obviously the very nature of God, we know that he's not bad and we know that he's not evil, but it's actually talking about him in a negative or an opposite way to an anthropomorphizing type of language. So if I were to say something along the lines of God is not evil, I'm not limiting him, because then I can infer from by saying God is not evil, I can infer that God is everything but evil. So I'm not limiting him by the way I use my language. Okay, I'm just skim reading through this slide. I think I've pretty much covered it anyway. But by talking about God in a good way or a human way, an understanding of God, we are limiting him. We're anthropomorphizing him. So even just by saying God is loving, well, Max the dog loves me. Okay, so I'm literally trying to equate the same types of word, the same types of language to God as to something that I already understand. So by using positive language, or language which we do understand, we are putting and setting limits on God. And now, if God is meant to be this kind of amazing, transcendent, omnipotent being, then human language is never, ever, ever going to cover how amazing God actually is. So, we should not use positive language, as I've said, because it's flawed, and we're only capable of understanding it in a context of human understanding. We would never be able to understand what good means if we liken it to God, because we're not on that level. So if we were to say that God is good, we can only understand what this means in terms of what we already know what good to mean, if that makes sense. I can only think of what God is like in my own understanding of what good actually is. So by using negative language, and again, negative language here doesn't mean God is bad, God is this, that and the other. We're not trying to make God or change God into this negative thing. We're trying to use language which doesn't limit him in any way. So by saying something which he is not, doesn't limit what he is. So like I've given you an example here. God is not bad is less limiting than God is good. Okay, so if I say God is good, I can again equate that to Max the dog being good. If I say God is not bad, then I can understand and I can infer from that that God is good, that he is loving, that he is just, that he is kind, that he is fair. Because all of those things are not bad. So it opens it up to a much wider discussion and to a much wider meaningfulness of what God actually is. Okay, so in order for you to try and get your own bit of practice in, and again, please don't cheat, please don't move on to the next slide, because I've given you the answers on the next slide because we're doing this remotely. But what I want you to do is have a look at the positive attribute comments that I've just given you down below. So God is good, God is just, God is all loving, and God is forgiving. Now each one of these under Via Negativa limits God, because I have a human understanding of what good, just, loving and forgiving actually is. And God is much, much more than what I would ever be able to understand in the way of human understanding. So for this little task, can you please try and write each of these statements as if you were doing Via Negativa? So just for an example, and I've given you this one already, so I don't mind giving you this one again. God is good, under Via Negativa would become God is not bad. Okay, because I'm not limiting him by saying that. I'll give you a few minutes to do that task. So, God is good, like we've already discussed, becomes God is not bad. So by saying God is not bad, I can then infer that he is good, kind, loving, just, fair, etc., etc. Okay? God is just becomes God is not unjust, or God is not unfair. So by saying something like God is not unfair, I then understand and I can infer that he must be fair, he must be kind, he must be loving, he must be just, he must be reasonable. So by saying the negative, or by way of negative language, I am opening up what God is rather than limiting him. So God is all loving becomes God is not hateful, which then again I can infer that he is loving, that he's kind, that he's fair, that he's fair. Let's keep it at that. Okay, and then God is forgiving. If I can then change that into the via negativa type of language, it would be that God is not unforgiving, or that God is not vengeful, or that God does not hold a grudge. Now, by saying things like God does not hold a grudge, I know, and again I can infer that he's forgiving, that he's kind, that he's loving, that he's good, that he's just, that he's appreciative, and all that kind of stuff. So by way of negatively associating what God is not, I can then infer much more about what God actually is, and I'm not limiting him to any type of human understanding. So, a scholar that's associated with via negativa is a man called Pseudo-Dionysius, and he was in kind of around in the 6th century, and Pseudo-Dionysius is one of the first people ever to kind of put forward the ideas of via negativa. And he said that the only way to speak truthfully about God is by the negative way, because God is beyond all human understanding. So by speaking of him negatively, we can infer and that we can understand what God is in a much broader sense than by just saying that God is good. So Pseudo-Dionysius is the first scholar associated with via negativa. Now, as you can see from this image at the bottom, he is obviously a Christian. Okay, he is a theologian, he's a philosopher, and he's a Christian mystic. So he is trying to prove that God exists. He's trying to make religious language meaningful. And I would say that he succeeds in doing what he sets out to do. But the way of negative language, or the via negativa, is a good way in which making religious language meaningful, because it's not limiting God in any way, shape or form. Another person associated with the via negativa is a man called Moses Maimonides, and he's a Jewish thinker and theologian. So again, he does believe in God, and he is maybe slightly biased because he is trying to prove that God exists, and he's trying to show that any type of God talk is meaningful rather than meaningless, and he strongly supported the via negativa. Now, what's really interesting is what you're probably thinking about is that what we've spoken about the Vienna Circle and the logical positivists, etc., was around in the 1920s. Now, as you can see, Maimonides and Pseudo-Dionysius are much previous to the 1920s. So religious language and discussing whether or not talking about religion in a meaningful way has been a question for hundreds of thousands of years. So the via negativa is not a new approach, but it is an approach which the Vienna Circle and the logical positivists took under their wing to try and assess whether or not religious language is meaningful. It would be wrong of the logical positivists to ignore attempts to assess whether or not religious language was meaningful prior to their formation. It would just be wrong, because they're logical positivists, and again, logical means that they have to assess all evidence given to them, or all evidence that they can get their hands on. So Pseudo-Dionysius and Maimonides, even though they were writing much before the logical positivists in the Vienna Circle, still make an appearance in the discussions to try and figure out whether or not religious language is meaningful. So Maimonides explains that the attributes of God can only be stood through what he is not. Again, because it doesn't anthropomorphize him, and it opens up God talk to much, much more than just a singular statement. Now, I personally think that Via Negativa is successful in trying to do what it does in terms of making religious language meaningful. However, there are obviously some negative points with the Via Negativa. So one of the main scholars is a man called Brian Davies, and he's actually really, really brilliant to read up on. I think, let me just check, I think I have a short extract in the Dialogue magazine. So I remember speaking to you about the Dialogue magazine at the very, very beginning of the course. It's brilliant, and their new magazine came out today. So I'm just having a quick flick through. If I can find, oh yeah, it is, the Religious Language and the Concept of God chapter. What I will do is I will try and scan this in tomorrow, or take some photos tomorrow to upload onto Show My Homework for you of the entire magazine, because the magazine itself is really, really useful. In the issue, we've got stuff about virtue ethics, religious language, something called God on Trial, which is, again, trying to figure out whether or not God is actually real or worth it. Free will and determinism, which is something we're going to have a look at in ethics, and the principle of double effect. So this Dialogue magazine is brilliant, and I would strongly, strongly recommend trying to get your hands on a copy, or downloading and subscribing to the magazine. I think it comes out quarterly, so 3-4 times a year, can't remember, but it really is worth it. It's definitely worth having a look, but I will try and scan it in to you tomorrow. But Brian Davies basically says that by telling you what something is not, gives you no clue what it actually is. Now this is where I'm going to refer you back to the starter of my kind of guess who the celebrity is. Now I've got a celebrity written on my piece of paper, and I've told you 8 things that person is not. So I've told you things like they are not an actor, they are not a singer, they are not a woman, they are not a movie star, they're not funny, they're not a Z-list celebrity, and they are not usually seen on anything but Channel 4. So I've given you a whole load of examples of what this person is not, but that actually doesn't give you any or much of a clue about who this person is, or what this person actually is in terms of what profession does he do. So this is the point that Brian Davies is basically trying to make. Davies basically says that declaring that God is not a wombat doesn't help me come to any understanding or much more of a conclusion to what God actually is. Now, you might not have any understanding or conclusion as to what my celebrity is. I was actually thinking of Jimmy Carr for some bizarre reason. But that small little task at the very, very beginning goes to demonstrate the issues that Brian Davies has with the Via Negativa. Just by saying that God is not evil doesn't actually tell me what God is. I can infer meaning, I can understand, again, in a human level, what God must be if he's not evil, but I still have no actual idea what God is. I've only just got my own assumptions. Another one of the problems that's highlighted through the use of negative language and the ideas of the Via Negativa is that one must have a presupposed idea in mind for these statements to make sense. So, the statement God is not bad does not show that God is good. Again, I have to try and imply it. So if I don't know what the word bad means, that statement using Via Negativa has no meaning. It doesn't actually mean anything. Also, language of that nature, of negative nature, is subjective, because I might have a different view of what bad is in comparison to you. So, for example, if I said God is not bad, then I would infer that he's loving. But if someone if you said that to somebody like Hitler, for example, God is not bad, he's going to have a different understanding or a different view of what bad is in the first place. So we're still not getting any closer to what God actually is. So what I would like you to do, as we've said already, negative language is supposed to allow one to come closer to God because it limits the anthropomorphism, and the language doesn't confuse. You're opening it up to much more debate, much more discussion, much more of an idea about God rather than just a statement such as God is good. So try and answer this question, please. To what extent does negative language allow one to come closer to God, or does it confuse the subject further? Have a go. It's completely independent, but it's also completely your opinion. This links to the AO2 side of things. So basically what you need to do here is weigh up why via negativa is a positive thing, but also why via negativa is a negative thing, and then come to an overall judgment. Does it work, or does it confuse the matter even further? And again, it's completely your opinion, and I look forward to seeing or hearing what you think regarding this. So, via negativa, as we've said, tries to, or is closely linked to, process of elimination. So, if I say God is not bad, I can eliminate everything which is bad, anything at all that I can understand. I can eliminate all of it because God is not those things. So if he's not, I can eliminate all those types of things, which again opens it up for much more discussion and much more understanding. But again, we still need to know before we start what the different possibilities are. So via negativa might not work for someone who began by knowing nothing of God in the first place. If I knew nothing of God, if I knew none of his qualities, nothing about what he was meant to be like, nothing about the creation of God, nothing about the Bible, etc, etc. I mean, if I'm assuming some of you probably don't know much about the God of Zoroastrianism. And if that's the case, if I tell you that the God of Zoroastrianism is not evil, that means nothing to you because you have no idea what that kind of God actually is like in the first place. So via negativa is difficult in that way because if I have no knowledge of God, talking about him positively or negatively is not going to have an impact. I'm not going to be able to infer, I'm not going to be able to understand through the process of elimination what God actually is. So, Pseudo-Dionysius and Maimonides state that positive language is deliberately leading us away from the understanding of God because it anthropomorphizes him, so it's leading us away from what God actually is. It could, however, be argued that negative language serves only as a way of stating what God is not, and fails to confirm anything about what God actually is. So in that respect, the idea of via negativa could be seen as being really flawed. Okay? And then finally, we must have some sort of comprehension of God, or some sort of understanding of God, to really be able to understand anything about him if we speak positively or negatively. So there are issues, but is it the best option we have in this instance? I'll leave that up to you to decide. What I've done on the next slide is I've given you, I think it's the next slide, I want you to have a look at some strengths and some negatives of the via negativa. Now obviously if we were doing this together, I'd like you to have done this in pairs, but the best piece of advice I would give you, that is because you're doing this on your own, is to have a look at the strengths and the weaknesses of via negativa in textbook 2, which is the white textbook, and I believe that you all have access to that anyway. And if you don't have access to that, I'm pretty sure that I've given you a PDF version of the textbook, and if I haven't, please let me know so that I can send some PDF versions of the textbook for you. But let me just find out what page it is on. Pseudo-Dionysius. So the strengths and weaknesses in the textbook 2, the white textbook, the evaluation of it in terms of looking at the strengths and the weaknesses starts on page 33 and ends on page 34. Now, try and come up with some strengths and weaknesses of your own just by understanding what you know of Via Negativa, and if you can't, then refer to the textbook. But it'd be really, really worth having a little look, and I will come up and I will show you in the next slide some strengths and some weaknesses. Please don't cheat. Try and do it on your own first. So, some of the strengths which I've found, or which I particularly like with Via Negativa, is it reminds us that language is unstable or understandable when it is applied to God. Okay, so again, it anthropomorphizes God, so it reminds us of the fact that our human language is not adequate enough to be able to apply to this kind of all excellent, all amazing being. It's designed to lead to truth and experience of God. So by saying what God is not, i.e. God is not bad, I can infer the truth about God being that he is good, that he is loving, that he is kind, that he is just, that he's fair, because it opens it up for much, much more discussion. So it does lead to a truth and to more of an experience of God, because I can infer much more from negative statements, by way of which is not, than I can understand through positive statements. It prevents anthropomorphism. It's more respectful towards God because I'm not limiting him in any way, and supports the view that God is beyond us all. So that's very obvious in the fact that if we use positive language, it does limit him to some extent, or her. It limits God to some extent, whereas by talking about him negatively, there is no limitation there. And only through Via Negativa can the transcendence of God be made clear. Okay, if we have a look at other things like the verification principle, strong or weak, and the falsification principle, there's nothing there which shows me that God is this transcendent, ultimate, kind of the greatest conceivable being. Whereas Via Negativa is one of the only approaches to religious language which really does that. It really tells you that God is transcendent, that he cannot be put on a human level, that he is completely beyond human understanding. And that's a strength, because God is meant to be that way. Again, use a textbook if you need to, but what are some of the weaknesses of Via Negativa? Try and do this again on your own without the textbook in the first place, because you should by now have an understanding of what Via Negativa actually is. So what are some of the weaknesses of it in the first place, before I give you the answers? Again, have a look at page 33 and page 34 in the white Year 2 textbook to help you with this if you need some help. But some of the weaknesses which I have found, or which I think is really, really positive to have a look at, is obviously the one of Brian Davis. By saying something, by talking about something in which it's not, it doesn't actually give you a clearer picture of what it is. So Brian Davis's really kind of poignant example is that if I say God is a wombat, is not a wombat, then I still have no idea about what God actually is. So the whole analogy of using a wombat is the one that Brian Davis used. So if you were to put this into some sort of essay, that would be a useful one to have a look at. How can it be useful to simply say what something is not? It's not useful, it doesn't answer any questions. If I want to know what God is like, by saying what he's not doesn't answer my question. It doesn't get to the point. The result is a very limited understanding of God in the first place, because it's really hard to describe a normal object in this way. So if I were to just describe, I don't know, a TV, it would take me so long to be able to tell, for you to be able to guess what I'm talking about, if I could only tell you what it's not. So if I'm talking about a TV, for example, and I said, it's not a wardrobe, it's not a curtain, it's not a book, it's not a bag, we're never going to get to the idea that it's a TV. You're never going to be able to guess that or come to that conclusion very easily. So by talking of things in a negative way, by what they're not, it doesn't actually, it's really hard to infer, it's really hard to get to the point of what he actually is. Doesn't reflect how religious believers speak of God. So even in religious sermons, for example, they say, oh, let's praise this ultimate God, this God that's really, really good. So even people who are religious don't talk about God using via negativa. They talk about God in a human way, which makes God easier to understand. So if religious people are not speaking by way of negatives, via negativa, then although it's a really good approach, it's a really good kind of design to have a look at whether or not religious language is meaningful, it's not practical. It doesn't work, and we can see that because religious people don't talk negatively or by way of negatives when considering God. And then finally, to say something negative is also to say something positive. So by saying a being is not immanent implies that he must be transcendent. So how is this different from simply saying that he's transcendent in the first place? By saying that God is not bad, then I can infer that God is good. So why am I making it more difficult? If that's the inference, if that's what I'm getting from saying God is not bad, why do I not just say God is good in the first place? Why am I making this a much longer process than what it needs to be? What I would like you to do with this slide, here are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are 7 different statements here about the ideas of via negativa. And what I would like you to do is rearrange these statements so it fits into a paragraph, as if you were in an exam or if you were answering a question. Rearrange these statements or rearrange these kind of bullet points into a paragraph which makes sense to be able to explain what the via negativa actually is, please. And then finally, what I would like you to do, this is an example of a 15-mark question, so an AO2 question, so you will need a little bit of AO1 in there, but it's mainly looking at your intro trade C layout and your intro trade C structure. Have a look at the only way in which meaningful statements can be made about God is the via negativa. So in this, it would be useful to bring in ideas of the Vienna Circle, the logical positivists, strong and weak verificationism, and the falsification principle, to try and come up with a really strong AO2 essay to show whether or not via negativa is appropriate to kind of answering the ideas about whether or not God is meaningful. If you can please send me your responses to this AO2. You might not be able to finish an entire essay, but you will be able to get definitely a few paragraphs in this by trying to figure out whether or not via negativa is successful or not in its claims that it makes any form of religious language meaningful. So send me this across, please, and I will read through them and I will get back to you with this as soon as I can. But for now, I believe that is this lesson over. So send me an email with who you thought the celebrity was that I was describing at the very, very beginning, your essay question, and any questions that you have about via negativa. I will also attach some reading about the via negativa to this PowerPoint, to this post on Show My Homework, so that you can get your head around it a little bit more. But hopefully that's quite clear for you. It's one of my favourite things to learn about via negativa when we look at religious language. So hopefully you've got it and you've enjoyed it as much as I have.